All right, guys, so if you've ever learned from me before, if you've watched my tutorials or courses, you know that I'm a very hands-on type of teacher. I like to show what's going on in the code by building actual projects and having you code along with me. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about what React is, why we use it, and a little bit of how it works. So React is a JavaScript library created and maintained by Facebook that's used for building user interfaces. So it's technically a UI library. Now, you've probably heard React referred to as a framework more than a library. In fact, I myself call it a framework, and the reason for that is because it's in direct competition with frameworks like Angular, and it does a lot of the same things, and it's used in a lot of the same way. The only difference between React and Angular is that React at its core is only responsible for creating user interfaces. It doesn't have things like a router or an HTTP client built in. However, we have popular packages like React Router DOM, then we have the Fetch API that's already built into the browser. So once you account for some of those things, then it's basically a framework. At least that's my explanation of why we call it a framework. So React gives us a way to build websites and front-end applications and UIs in an organized way with reusable components. So components can include the output, which is basically the HTML. In React, we use something called JSX, and we'll get into that later. The logic, or the JavaScript, and you can also include the styling, or the CSS, within your components as well, which is a little different than the old school way of doing things. Like when I got started with web development, everything was separate. You had your HTML file, you had your CSS file, you had your JavaScript file, and it was all separate. And with React and other front-end frameworks, we do things in kind of a different way where instead we look at our UI as different components. So the search bar, the header, the footer, each blog post, everything we look at as a component. So we'll be talking about that as we move along through the course. Now, before we move any further, I just want to talk a little bit about what you should know before learning React, or at least what I suggest you should know before jumping into not only React, but any framework. So I'd say you need to learn the basics of JavaScript, including things like data structures, variables, arrays, objects, loops, functions, etc. You should understand the document object model, or the DOM, and how it's structured, and just some basic manipulation with vanilla JavaScript. In my opinion, you should also know about the popular high-order array methods like for each, map, filter, reduce, find, etc. And these are used all over the place in JavaScript. So I think they're super important to understand when working with data and arrays. Arrow functions are really popular in modern JavaScript and really useful. We'll be using them quite a bit. Asynchronous programming in JavaScript and using promises is also really important. Understanding the dot then and dot catch syntax, as well as async await. Also the Fetch API, because in many cases you're using React on your front end and you're sending requests to a back-end API, whether it's your own or a third-party API. So knowing Fetch is really important. You might also know third-party HTTP clients like Axios. And then NPM, or Node Package Manager, is also important because oftentimes we use third-party packages that we'll be installing with NPM. We also use NPM just to create a new React application. So these things, in my opinion, are essential to know before jumping into any framework. I do have a course called Modern JavaScript from the Beginning that teaches all of this. It will be updated soon, but not much has changed in terms of the fundamentals, so it's all still very relevant. So why learn React? Why not just build all your front ends with just HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript? Well, as I said before, things used to be really messy with no consistency. You'd have everything would be separate. React and frameworks in general have made it much easier to organize our user interfaces, or our front ends. And when I say front end, I mean the user-facing website or application, what we see in the browser. One of the main reasons it gives us organization is with reusable components. We look at every website and UI as a set of components. Like I said, the search box, the header, all that stuff is looked at as a component. It allows us to organize our code much better. React is also very flexible. You can use it in many different ways. You can use it for just part of a project if you want. It can be used with mobile apps with React Native. You could use it along with something like Electron and create a desktop application. You now have server-side rendering with Next.js. There's just so many things you can do in so many different ways with the React library or framework. React is also very popular. I'd say it's the most popular front-end framework in the world at this point. There's a ton of big companies using it. If you're looking to find a job, it's a great framework to choose. Since it's so popular and maintained by Facebook, which is one of the largest companies in the world, you have a ton of support. So there's a great community, a huge community around React. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and if you run into problems, it's pretty easy to find help. React also performs very well. It uses something called the virtual DOM, or virtual document object model. We have separate components in the UI that have something called state, and when a component state changes, React basically compares the existing DOM state with what the new DOM should look like, and then it finds the least expensive and most efficient way to update the DOM. So it's very fast and performant. All right, so React is very declarative, and what I mean by that is we write the code that we want, and React is in charge of taking our declared code and performing all of the JavaScript and DOM steps to get us the result that we want. So if we look at this code here, you don't really have to understand React to be able to visualize what this would look like in a browser. So each one of these tags that we're looking at is a component. We have the app itself, then we have a header, an employee search, an employee list, and a footer component. And this is how we embed components. It's similar to just an XML syntax. And components can also have props passed in, which are basically attributes or arguments that can be passed to that component. So here we have a title prop passed into a header component, and it could be just a regular string or any data type as well as a function. The employee list component takes in a prop of employees. In this case, employees is a variable which would most likely include an array of employee objects. Then in employee list, you could iterate through those objects and output each one in its own component. So components and props are really important. We also have something called state that we're going to learn about. And state is basically just data. You can have component level state. For instance, maybe you have a menu component that can be toggled. So you might have an opened and closed state. That only has to do with that single component. Then you have app level state, which is data that's going to be used in multiple components. So for example, the employees that you might fetch from a database, that's probably going to be your app level state that you can use in multiple components. So events are another big part of React because we often have buttons and input fields that fire off some kind of event to make something happen. So I would say that these four things are the building blocks of not only React, but of many front-end frameworks. And if you don't understand any of this right now, that's absolutely fine. The first project, the feedback app, we're going to talk about these four things in depth and look at all the syntax to create and use them. So instead of just showing you a bunch of boring slides, we're going to go through everything from within our code. And it's just easier for me to teach that way. And in my experience, most students prefer that over looking at diagrams and stuff. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and prepare our machine for React development and talk about some of the tools involved.